Chapter 13, Section 3, Effects of the New Deal. How did the New Deal change the social, economic, political landscape of the United States for future generations? So we'll look at how the New Deal affected different groups in American society. We'll look at how the New Deal is going to change the shape of the American political parties, and then the impact FDR is going to have on the office of the presidency. So when we look at some of the groups, women definitely are a group that is going to make gains under President Roosevelt. If we look at just Eleanor Roosevelt herself as First Lady, all First Ladies before Eleanor, it was pretty much ceremonial. They would host dinners and those types of things, but it was a very limited role. With Eleanor Roosevelt, you see her become more involved. She had a newspaper column that was widely carried across the nation. She would hold press conferences. And one of the things that she did to help promote women was to say, newspapers, you have to have a female reporter that comes and covers my press conference. I'm not going to allow any men in the press conference. And what that did is it forced major newspapers to hire female reporters so that they could gain access to Eleanor Roosevelt and the things that she was saying and doing at these press conferences. Another key woman is Frances Perkins. She is going to play a critical role as Secretary of Labor in the Social Security Act, and then she is also going to help push through the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is going to begin to have a minimum wage, a minimum work week, and also that's going to end, for the most part, child labor. With all of these groups, I'm also going to have but. So even though they do make inroads, it goes a long ways to moving the United States in the right direction. But at the same time, it's still a very conservative White House. So there still is this reinforced gender differences. So for example, the Civilian Conservation Corps, women aren't able to work in it. When you look at a ruling that takes place, is a husband and a wife are both professors. They are both teaching at the same university. And what ends up happening is when they find out that this married wife was working, she was fired, but the husband was allowed to continue to work. And so the other thing about a lot of these things too is the focus is on hiring men first, because the idea is men are the breadwinners and they need jobs so that they can provide for their families. And so they don't even consider the fact that maybe the woman is the primary breadwinner. And there is a lot of single family homes because of the stress of all of the Great Depression. That became a little bit more prevalent, I guess. African Americans are another group that are going to make some advances. There's still some challenges. Eleanor Roosevelt is not just a leader on women's rights issues, but also on civil rights. She's very outspoken about racial discrimination. The book shares the story of her at the Southern Conference on Human Welfare. When she gets there, she sat with the African Americans, and this is down south, and so she had violated the segregation laws. So the police officer came and told her that she needed to move. Well, rather than go sit with the whites, what she did is she put her chair halfway in between, and she gave her speech from that spot where she was trying to show this bridge between the two. The other example is Marian Anderson, who's a world famous opera singer. She had been asked to sing, and she was supposed to do it at the Daughters of the American Revolution Hall, and when they found out she was African American, they wouldn't allow her to sing there. And so what Eleanor Roosevelt did is she quit being the Daughters of the American Revolution. So what Eleanor Roosevelt did is she arranged for Marian Anderson to sing at the Washington Mall in front of a large audience. Also, for the Black Cabinet, he surrounds himself with African American leaders who are his advisors. Probably one of the more famous ones is Mary McLeod Bethune. And so you see African Americans have far more access to the government and the White House than any previous administration. Now, on the flip side of that, FDR is still falling short. When he's pushed to pass or to sign and pass anti-lynching law, he refuses to do it because he's not willing to pay the political price by losing Southern Democrats. African Americans are going to receive lower wages, and there's a lot of New Deal legislation where they're either not covered or they're hurt by the New Deal, especially the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The Agricultural Adjustment Act is going to pay farmers not to plant crops down south in the sharecropping system. What farmers would do is they would continue to plant the fields that they had always planted, and what they let lie fallow was the fields that were farmed by the sharecroppers, and a lot of those sharecroppers were either extremely poor whites, but more likely they were African Americans. And so then what ends up happening is these African Americans no longer have a place to farm, and the farmers are getting double payments still. They're getting the traditional amount that they had for their fields, and then they're getting paid for essentially kicking the sharecroppers off of their fields. For Native Americans, they're probably the group that maybe benefits the most. John Collier is going to take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he's going to push for Native Americans to have greater control over their reservations, and he's also going to help encourage traditional practices, whether it be religion or language, and so you really see Native Americans begin to have more control over their lives and to be able to celebrate their culture. So under this Indian Reorganization Act, that's really where they're going to turn control over Native American lands to the tribes, and so that they're able to kind of control their destinies and have more influence and more say over what's going to happen on their reservation. Now, the flip side, if we look at the Navajo Livestock Reduction Program, the Navajo had been breeding these sheep that they used to produce their Navajo rugs. So what the Agricultural Adjustment Act is doing, again, to try and increase the prices for things, they end up killing a large number of these Navajo Chiro sheep. In the 1860s, the Navajo had an estimated 2 million of those. By 1972, the herd was down to about 450. Now, it's slowly recovered to 4,500 today, roughly, but that's a far cry from the 2 million. And that was a thing that the Navajo were always very proud of, were their sheep. When we look at how is it going to transform the politics and the political landscape, what you see, this New Deal coalition, groups of people who typically didn't vote the same are now going to vote for Democrats because of the New Deal. You see Southern whites, Northern blue-collar workers, Midwest farmers, and the biggest switch is African Americans are going to go from the party of Lincoln, the Republicans, and begin to vote for Democrats. And this is where we're going to see the shift in African Americans from being loyal Republican voters to becoming loyal Democrats and voting for Democrats. And this is going to shift presidential elections from here on out. The other place that it's going to really kind of change things is these New Deal Democrats. From 1932 to 1995, the Democrats are going to control the House of Representatives in all but 4 of those years. The other thing is when you look at the presidency, they're going to win 6 out of the next 8 elections. And it's not going to be until we get to Ronald Reagan, where we have the conservative revolution in 1980, that's really going to switch. And so you can see this New Deal beginning in 1931-33, the blue is Democrats, the red is Republicans, and you can see this impact that the New Deal and this New Deal coalition is going to have on the Senate, the House of Representatives, and then if I had one for the presidency, you'd be able to see it for the presidency as well. So when we look at the role of government, the government is going to change. It's going to become the way we think of the government today. It's going to play a far bigger role in the economy. Now we're kind of expecting the government to do things ahead of time to bail the economy out or to prevent economic downturns. It's going to create somewhat of a welfare state where it's going to take on more responsibility for citizens. So for example, Social Security Act, that's going to create a retirement program. That was something that the government had never done before. then you lead to this debate over the proper role. How much is too much? Is the government doing too much? And if you look at the restoring of the environment, a lot of the New Deal legislation is going to impact the environment with conservation, restoring it, all kinds of new national parks, a ton of dams. And the negative part of the dams is that that's going to kind of screw up the native migration of fish. And so one of the big debates currently is these dams are pushing, almost 100 years old now when we're looking at 1930s being when these were built. There's a lot of arguments that these dams should be let go and so that the fish can go back to their more traditional breeding grounds and habitats and migration patterns. And that's the other thing too. Some of these things that were built in the 1930s that are now kind of getting run down, and what do we do with it? How do we preserve it? Do we not preserve it? And when you really look at probably the biggest impact of the New Deal, it would be on the presidency. And we start to talk about this imperial presidency. FDR is going to get elected 4 times. He is going to increase his power throughout this. His style is going to impact the way future presidents are going to act. And when you look at under his leadership, the government plays a much bigger role in the economy and social policy. And that just was something that hadn't happened before.